Hello, I'm Sean Lim, and welcome to After 10. With all the overlapping trade blocs around the world, what risks and opportunities are presented by the U.S.-led Trans-Pacific Partnership? On today's After 10, we discuss this massive regional trade bloc and whether Korea should take part. Stay with us.
The Pak administration expressed interest in participating in TPP negotiations. Existing TPP countries are welcoming Korea's participation as well.
The United States welcomes Korea's interest in joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership. With Korea added, it'll be impossible for the rest of the world to resist moving toward sane 21st century rules of the road.
The TPP is a multilateral free trade zone for the Asia-Pacific region. There are currently 12 countries committed to the TPP, and Korea is the 13th to express its intent to take part. The Korea Institute for International Economic Policy estimates a maximum increase of 2.6% GDP in 10 years if Korea joins the TPP. The opportunities and challenges of the TPP. We will take a thorough look today on After 10.
Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight on After 10.
Thank you for having me.
Well, after keeping its distance from the TPP, the Korean government last month expressed its interest in researching its position on whether to join the TPP. Why does the Korean government now take this stance to explore this trade pact?
It's important to understand, in order to understand the timing, it's important to understand the context. TPP is not something that's been under negotiation for the past 1 or 2 years. In fact, it has its beginning way back in 2005. U.S. had invited South Korea to join in 2010. So this is something that's been going on for some time. Now, lately, with Japan's entry this year, there's been some momentum on this agreement. So perhaps time was right for Korea's entry at this particular moment in time. Also, the size. Originally, when TPP was first conceived in 2005, 2008, there was only a handful of countries that were involved. Now we have 13, 12 countries. If we include Korea into that pack, it's going to be 13. And it accounts for about 40% of the world's GDP. Quite sizable. Another factor to take into consideration. Thirdly, it's also important to understand that TPP accession is a process that takes time. So if Korea was going to sit at the negotiating table and bargain on some of the terms, that it needed to do this as soon as it possibly can in order to get itself into the bargaining table.
So at the moment, though, from what I understand, it's too late for Korea to be at the current bargaining table because they entered late. Do you think that's a problem?
The TPP negotiations would not be concluded by the end of this year, that it would spill over into next year. So if the negotiations, because the accession process is a process and it is a time-consuming process, if the negotiations were to end by the end of this year, then Korea would have had no chance to get in on the bargaining table to negotiate. But given that the negotiations will now spill over into next year, and it's anybody's guess as far as how far that's going to go, but the last public statement by the Vice Minister of Economy from Japan is that they're 65% towards completion, that there's remaining 35% of the agreements that needs to be sort of hammered out for there to be a consensus for the agreement to now then go through the ratification process. So it's anybody's guess how long it would take for these parties to come to an agreement on those remaining 35% issues or chapters in TPP that needs to be agreed upon.
So let's talk about the comparisons between the current FTAs out there. Would you say the TPP is going to be bigger than any free trade agreement?
Will it open up the markets and go beyond tariffs to the harmonization of these other regulatory or regulations that we had talked about just a minute ago? If they don't achieve the high standard, then it may not amount to much because Korea and United States, among others, already have free trade agreements with many of these partners. But if it goes beyond tariffs, and to the extent that it does, then you can see some sizable gains in trade and more flow of goods and services across borders.
So the country in the driver's seat for this TPP is the United States. What are the pros and cons of that?
The U.S. is pushing its weight to complete the agreement. Could be a good thing. The bad side, obviously, is that this is not an agreement that is mutually agreed upon, where smaller countries are able to get their share of the agreement. That is, this may not turn out to be a fair agreement.
And does that include Korea?
Well, it depends. So again, in order to get the agreement, you need every country to agree. And consensus is not an easy thing to accomplish. It's in United States' best interest to get this to be what they claim as a high standard agreement. And what that suggests is that they could probably twist the other party's arms just so far. And they're having, part of the reason why they're having this issue and not being able to complete the agreement this year are the areas of disagreement with Japan, which is not a small player in this game. So on the issue of agriculture, for instance. So U.S. can use their weight, but how far can they do so without breaking the agreement is anybody's guess, because we're not sitting at the negotiating table, so we don't really know exactly what's going on, aside from all the other information that's being leaked out into the press and among pundits as well.
So that's been some talk in these academic and trade circles that China actually, instead of being a foe to the TPP, might just want to join in and save all the work that it would have to do with its own RCEP?
That is also difficult to believe as well, because what that would mean is that China would be giving up its comparative advantage with respect to trade with these other countries.
And being in the driver's seat of that agreement.
That's right. And so they probably wouldn't want to liberalize at the pace and in the manner that the TPP partners would like to liberalize. For instance, on the issue of state-owned enterprise, which the Vietnamese are hoping that the other TPP partners would not push down on them. That is, to minimize the level of state-owned enterprises working in the economy. And Vietnam, in this regard, is very similar to China. It's not in China's best interest to completely do away with the state-owned corporations in China, which are some of the largest.
And this is a big part of the TPP, to reduce the number of state-owned enterprises and organizations?
Right. So the well, because it's not a fair competition.
It could be manipulated by the government.
Exactly. And the government, it's not going to be a fair competition. That is, if foreign corporations come in and they're competing with state-owned enterprises, they're not competing on the bottom line. The state-owned enterprises also have government subsidies. They have certain kinds of benefits that private corporations do not have. So these are concerns with respect to competition, market competition in the economy. The Chinese obviously wouldn't want to give up that advantage.
Right.
The TPP in 2002 started its negotiations under the name of TPSEP. In 2008, the official name changed to TPP as the United States, Australia, and other countries joined. Even before the Pak administration launched, it has been thoroughly examining its participation in the TPP. And this November, the Korean government officially showed its intentions to join the TPP. The sheer economic scale of participating countries of the TPP currently surpasses the EU. Research from the Asan Institute for Policy Studies shows that 60% of the Western Hemisphere's trade volume would drop to 50% if Korea takes part in the TPP. Korea's participation in the TPP is gaining attention as a variable in global trade.
So to start this process, Korea started bilateral talks, I believe, with Australia. Is this going to be the future, that Korea has to go to each individual country, 12 so far, and then iron things out?
So in order to understand why the bilateral consultations need to happen, you have to understand the requirements, the rules of the game. The TCEP agreement, which is agreed upon by the three original members that started this TPP, that later became TPP, has certain statement in there about accession rules. That is, all the parties would have to agree that the new member country can sit at the bargaining table with them. So it has to be a consensus-based agreement.
So they've all agreed with each other, these current 12, so they've all had their bilateral talks with each other?
With respect to the FTA agreement with the United States, 96% of all goods tariff would be lowered to make it a free trade area agreement between those two countries within 5 to 10 years. That liberalization ratio that the WTO kind of keeps track of is about 96%. That's pretty good. And from U.S.'s point of view, there doesn't need to be much of a bilateral consultation with Korea about these issues. So, but there are other countries. There are countries like, for instance, Mexico or Japan that might have issues with Korea's entry into the TPP, and they may set certain kinds of conditions for the Korean government to, I don't know, do something about XYZ issues with respect to trade or intellectual property. We would like these issues to be managed before we can agree to have you on board to negotiate on this. So the last country that's had some difficulty coming on board to TPP was Canada, if I recall. In 2010, United States and New Zealand had issues with Canada's agricultural policy and intellectual property protection. So they blocked Canada's accession until 2012. So that could happen. But I don't see why any country would have issues with Korea's economy or its rules on trade. Korea is one of very few countries that have cross-regional bilateral FTAs with many, many countries. In fact, based on our study, Korea is very unique in this regard. There are only few countries that have gone beyond their regional boundaries to link different regions with one another. Chile is another case in point.
So with Korea doing as much as it has with expanding its trade, how much of a benefit will this TPP bring in?
Korea has FTAs with many of these countries, but there are some sizable partners that we do not have a free trade agreements with. These include Japan and Mexico. And the free trade agreements there have stalled in those two cases. So TPP, if Korea is entered into TPP and TPP agreement comes about next year, and let's say it's ratified by the following year, what Korea would have is a de facto bilateral FTA through TPP with Japan and Mexico.
Well, compared to the Korea, China, Japan FTA that is currently in the works, will the TPP provide a benefit with our trade with Japan that is not covered?
So what many experts, including myself, think about the benefits of TPP, one of the other benefits, other than the ones that we talked about earlier, is that TPP can become an impetus for other countries that are not in TPP to start a new agreement or to speed up existing agreements. So from China's position, as I mentioned earlier, it could be a foregone opportunity cost for China in terms of gains. If that's the case, then the Chinese would want to speed up RCEP or CJK FTA to get that through as quickly as they can. The other thing that TPP can do with regards to Japan is that it can serve as a template. You already have a working template in TPP, so there doesn't need to be another set of negotiation for a separate FTA because you would have harmonization under TPP anyways. So those are some additional benefits that we can think of other than the ones that we talked about earlier. And on top of that, which I didn't mention earlier, is the economic gains. So there are different kinds of estimates about the economic gains. Some estimates that I've seen, the trade trade for Korea is supposed to increase by about $14 billion between, and I guess this is an annual data, but between 2010 to 2025 was the estimate that I've seen.
14 billion every year.
Right. And the overall income gain is supposed to be about 22 billion. There are different estimates about these. These are forecasts and projections. Some go 15 years, some go 10 years. But in general, everybody seems to agree that there's going to be some pretty sizable gains in GDP and economic growth. Not a lot, but modestly.
Right, 14 billion out of over a 1 trillion GDP a year doesn't sound like that much.
It's not a huge deal, but if you don't sign, there could be potential negative losses, right, exactly.
Well, speaking of losses, sensitive industries like the agricultural, livestock industries in Korea have voiced their concerns about many of the free trade agreements out there. It seems as if when it's a bilateral trade agreement, there can be individualization. But with the TPP, does that pose an even greater threat to that industry and also maybe even the country's sovereignty?
Right. You raise a very important point, and this is going to be the make or break issue when it comes time for ratification. And it's not only Korea. All of these countries will have to adjust after these agreements are put in place and it goes through implementation. So there are some adjustment costs that all of the countries will have to go through. How much of that is bearable, how much is simply unacceptable? It's a political question to some extent. Chile-Korea Free Trade Agreement or Korea-US Free Trade Agreements, there were measures in place after these agreements were signed to redistribute some of the gains from trade to the farmers, for instance. In the case of KORUS FTA, Korea had its own system of trade adjustment assistance that was not geared towards workers, but actually geared more towards businesses. The size of the pie is quite large. If you take a look at the Chile-Korea FTA and the amount of agricultural subsidies that were established, it's about $1.2 trillion over 10 years. For KORUS, it was about 20.4 trillion won. And for the trade adjustment assistance portion, $26 million for firms that have lost about 25% of their sales as a result of free trade agreements. So these are measures that the government and these various interests can negotiate to soften the blow, so to speak. I mean, I guess the better way to put it is not to shield these sectors from the harm that may come about from TPP, but really the goal here is how to best adapt and to make it as less painful as possible in that adaptation process.
Right, and gear them more towards the global economy. So if Korea would like to go ahead with the trade pact, it still has to navigate through all the so-called spaghetti bowl of other FTAs to make sure that there's no conflicts there. How should it go about that path?
Well, one of the key benefits, aside from the ones that we mentioned earlier, of TPP is that it would actually harmonize these spaghetti bowl or noodle bowl of different
Would it
FTAs.
supersede these other FTAs?
Right, to the extent that if you have exceptions to the TPP rule because of these FTA, that you're essentially breaking or less diluting the agreement, you would have to try to make these agreements work. So there needs to be some hard work. I guess this is the better way to put it, that TPP would not supersede all FTAs, but that this work needs to be done, and TPP would get the right administrators to get that work done. That is, to have that harmonization of rules.
Do you think all this hard work will eventually succeed?
Well, here's the other portion of this. Now, if you think about this from an economic standpoint, whether it will succeed or not is, I don't know. I'm not sure if I could answer that question adequately. But what I think I can answer is there's clearly benefits to harmonizing these rules, especially for businesses.
So overall, would you say we should sign up?
I see more benefits than downsides to the TPP. And let me point out another thing here. Just because you agree to participate in the negotiations for TPP doesn't mean you agree to be a member of TPP and its final stages. You can, and I think the Korean government has made that very clear.
So it's definitely good to be talking at this stage.
Right. I don't think there's anything wrong with expressing an interest, talking to the different parties, engaging in the bilateral consultations, and find out what the advantages and disadvantages are. And then if you want to decide to participate in the negotiations and get in on the bargaining table, and if you find that this is not something that's going to work out for you, you can drop that ball any minute and it'll be fine. You're not a part of that.
And that's what the Korean government is doing right now.
I guess so.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Well, thanks for having me.
And that does it for us tonight on After 10. Please join us again next time.